listening to Working in Oncology, a podcast and video show that spotlights oncology practice staff and industry influencers who work behind the scenes to shape the future of oncology. The more knowledge the oncology community shares with each other, the more we all grow. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Working in Oncology. I'm your co-host for the day, Alicia Evans, and I'm joined by Sherin Al-Safadi, Global Medical Affairs Strategy Lead Oncology with Bayer Pharmaceuticals.
Hi, Alicia.
Hi, Sherin. Thank you and welcome to the show. I'm really excited about our conversation today. So when it comes to oncology care, I think many of us are in a little bit of a bubble. So we may not have the opportunity to learn or experience a wide variety of treatment types within the same specialty, let alone learn about what cancer care looks like across the globe, right? So I think you'll be able to provide some fascinating insights to our audience.
I sure hope so. I can definitely reflect on that from, a pharmaceutical employee standpoint and sort of the big trends and steps forward we've taken to support oncology care on the pharma side, and also being in a global role, looking at maybe some of these differences that we see across the globe.
Absolutely. But before we jump in the show, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about you, your background, and what you do?
Sure. So I was first exposed to drug development, the concept of drug development, when I was in college in my undergraduate years. And I quickly developed a passion for it. And then I spent several years in academia going through graduate degrees to be able to get into the industry. And at that point, I realized there was a huge divide between the academic world and the industry and the clinical world. And so what that means, what that translates is this divide from bench to bedside, true bedside. So not only getting drugs approved, but also providing patients access, especially in the oncology world. And so that became a passion. And over the years, after schooling, I joined the industry with Bayer. First, I was with the Canadian team, and then I relocated to the US with the global team now. So I'm actively pursuing that. And we have many different divisions and functions within Bayer as well. But we all work collectively towards the same goal, which is getting the data we need to get these drugs approved and also providing access for patients within oncology, which is one of the most complex landscapes, as you know.
Sounds like an interesting experience and a noble goal.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rewarding, right? In the absence of being able to deliver care directly to patients, just listening to what they want, understanding their needs, and being able to navigate with different stakeholders, whether it's physicians, pharmacists, payers, regulatory agencies like the FDA, is working very closely with that group of stakeholders to be able to provide that. So we have a long way to go still, but I think we've taken huge steps forward from an industry standpoint.
So I've heard you in the past mention an ecosystem of allied health professionals. So the system of nurses and other health professionals responsible for making sure that patients get optimal care. So how do you incorporate them into the therapy development process?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. So traditionally, when we think of who we work with in the clinical context, it's always been traditionally for pharma, the healthcare professional, the treater, the oncologist in the context of oncology. And that's not the case anymore. We've really changed the paradigm of that group that we work with. So when we think of the patient, first and foremost, we really put the patient at the center of this model, this caregiving model that we focus on from a pharma standpoint. And we look around the patient and we see, aside from the oncologist or the key opinion leader or HCP, you have the family members, caregivers, and then you have this allied network of healthcare professionals that include nurses, nurse practitioners, research nurses, clinical coordinators, patient advocacy groups as well. So these are stakeholders that we are just as important to us, that we work very closely with. And so from a research development standpoint, of course, you have a lot of these roles that are integral parts of the clinical trial process, right? Whether they're directly involved in the clinical trials themselves, whether they are involved as part of a multidisciplinary team that's delivering the care in this clinical trial setting. So from that context, they're extremely important. The other reason we have such a big focus, and we're really trying to work on our relationships and understanding with this group of allied professionals, is to understand what are the feedback that they give with regards to the patient's journey and the pain points that come with that patient's journey, especially in the oncology world, where multidisciplinary care is so important. So we get them heavily involved even before a drug is approved in advisory boards, focus groups, medical education, continuing medical education events, and different platforms where we really focus on listening to the allied healthcare professionals to see what else is coming out, what other feedback and guidance can they give us to help us optimize our clinical trial process, our protocols, right? Sometimes protocols we put in place become outdated very quickly. And then I would say most importantly, what we rely on is also understanding the patient needs and the patient voice. So in oncology, as you know, a lot of times patients don't necessarily have the opportunity, unfortunately, to voice what their needs and their goals, their treatment goals are. A lot of times it defaults to what the oncologist wants, which could be overall survival, extending survival by a few months. But then when you speak to a patient, you start to understand, well, you know, this patient does want to attend their grandson's, wedding, or wants to go attend this golf game. And now it becomes really important to try and balance the patient's goals and that quality of life element with which treatments are being prescribed by the oncologist. Patients, unfortunately, don't have the opportunity to voice that, in part because it's not necessarily top of mind for the oncologist. They want to treat aggressively. And in other part, it's because the patients don't necessarily want to speak up or don't have that strong voice. So a lot of times they actually default to the allied healthcare professionals that are part of that treatment journey to talk. They have the opportunity to socialize and to speak and to voice what's on their minds. And that voice becomes delivered indirectly through a lot of the nurses and nurse practitioners that we see. So that interaction is extremely important for everyone involved, especially the patients.
So it seems like the allied health professionals are kind of making a bridge between what the patient is explicitly explaining to the provider, the physician, and
Yes.
what the patient's actual needs are.
Absolutely.
Kind of the translator.
Absolutely. The translator and getting to the crux of what is it that the patient wants to.
Excellent. It's exciting that you're incorporating those insights into the therapy development process.
It's so important for us. It's this loop. It's traditionally we think of drug development as pushing clinical trials and studies and then products out, and that's really changed. Now we get this early insights and feedback that come in from patients, from oncologists, treaters, allied healthcare professionals, and it really helps us shape, as we move forward with drug development, the way we design our protocols, thinking of what is it that the patient's going to want ultimately from this drug that would hopefully be addressing an unmet need.
It's almost like a co-creation kind of almost model.
Absolutely.
I love it. As a global medical affairs strategy lead, you have insights into the state of oncology care around the world. Can you tell us some major differences you see from one nation to another? Anything that stands out in particular?
Sure. Yeah. I guess when I think of major differences, I'm going to think of the inequalities that exist mainly across the different countries that, at least, based on my personal experience, we see. And I would say they narrow down, or they filter to three big buckets. The first one is really around the treatment availability, first and foremost, why some treatments are available in some countries and not other countries. And that really boils down to the patient population itself and the needs. Is this an unmet need in this country? The way the clinical trials are designed, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, the patient populations that are included, ranging from age to ethnicity and otherwise, where the trials are located as well, that's a big part too. So if you have great studies that read out from certain countries but don't incorporate other certain patient populations based on their genetic profile, their ethnicities, then it's not a go-ahead given in that country to get the drug approved. So it's multifactorial, But when it comes down to it, I'd say we've taken big steps forward in trying to consider global needs, but nevertheless, there are several instances where drugs just aren't approved in certain countries. More often than not, what ends up happening is that there's a lag of time until we're able to address what that regulatory agency in that specific country needs. So there's still very, very strong follow-up as a key priority to make sure drug treatments are available. But the treatment availability is definitely one. The other one that's heartbreaking is the access to drugs and reimbursement. So this one is unfortunately not only looking any better, it's actually looking a little bit worse in the sense that in the oncology world, drugs are very expensive. And now more than ever, research has taken big steps forward and we are seeing new modalities, a lot of new mechanisms of action and modalities that are coming our way in a clinical trial perspective and even getting approved by a lot of these regulatory agencies, including the FDA. But the issue is who's paying for the drug? Some countries have public payers and private payers. Other countries, the drug is only out of pocket. So there's a huge discrepancy and inequality when it comes to that across the world. And so what ends up happening is for some countries that can't afford to cover these drugs, because unfortunately it does have a financial burden on society, is that a lot of oncologists have no choice, their hands are tied, but to default back to maybe generic drugs, something like old traditional chemotherapies, where they still work, but it comes at the cost of quality of life for patients. And we know that there are equally, if not more efficacious drugs and just as safe, or if not safer, that give a better quality of life out there and approved, but the patient can't afford it. So it's very frustrating to watch this. We do what we can, of course, to make sure that that access is there. But at the same time, to be fair, I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the payers, because the payers have to make very difficult decisions, right? More therapies are coming their way. There are other therapeutic areas outside oncology that also need coverage. So it is a difficult decision. We can advocate as much as we want for patients, but there has to be a balance as well with the burden of the financial burden of the treatment, the cost of the treatment on society as well. So it's that area is very tricky. And then I think the last area that I'd probably want to highlight here is precision medicine, because we're talking about oncology, and this is everything that oncology represents right now is moving towards precision medicine. And so with precision medicine, when you're looking at finding that specific treatment for the right patient with the right patient profile at the right time, a big part of that is the molecular testing, the testing that has to come with it to identify the patient. So, I mean, some countries like the US are very much far ahead when it comes to testing. Other countries, unfortunately, don't have the infrastructure, the technologies, or even the knowledge, the medical education to try and understand how they can leverage new testing platforms to identify these patients that have genetic alterations, find out what these alterations are, these drivers, and assign a targeted therapy to them. So there's a huge, huge discrepancy in that, even though we're moving light years quickly ahead towards precision medicine and making this a standard of care. So yeah, those are the three buckets: the treatment availability, reimbursement and access issues, and precision medicine, and the testing that comes with that.
You also see a large a discrepancy, a difference in patient care, in urban versus rural settings in the States. And I think we run into a lot of those same issues that you're seeing globally.
Yeah.
So a patient, on the East Coast versus the Midwest might not get the same treatment just because there's not availability. There's not a lack of access.
Absolutely. In community settings, right? A lot of these big academic sites have the technologies that they need to be able to treat, new emerging, they're at the forefront. Clinical trials too, that's really important, because in oncology, as you know, clinical trials are considered a line of therapy, not just a potential for a new drug, but a true line of therapy itself that usually come a little bit later, or depending where, especially in advanced stages of cancer. So you're absolutely right when it comes to community, because of distance, because of accessibility, because of feasibility, not being able to be directed towards an academic site, or not even having the time or someone to drive them to be a part of a clinical trial. There's really a huge discrepancy and an inequality in trials there.
It's really unfortunate. Maybe these things um, will expand in the future, where more people will have access to these clinical trials, even though they're not located in a major city.
Yeah, definitely. And from our end too, from a pharma standpoint, when we look at setting up trials, we never only look at academic sites, we're also looking at community involvement and the infrastructure that's there to be able to provide adequate access for patients, or at least a very clear platform where we can support patients coming in from a community setting to an academic setting in the best way possible.
Wonderful. So, are there any practices that you've noticed internationally that you wish would be implemented in the United States? I know you mentioned that the United States was a little bit ahead of the curve on the molecular testing. What are some things that you find stateside that we're kind of behind the curve that we can, space for improvement?
So, I mean, and you know, the US is really at the forefront in oncology care in a lot of areas. From a research standpoint, definitely being able to bring drugs to market as quickly as possible, really being the leading country or one of the top countries that allow that approval process and access process to happen very quickly, that then triggers sort of a snowball effect for other countries coming in that are very dependent on FDA regulation. So a lot of best practices here as well when it comes to psychosocial support. I've noticed that too. And obviously there are cultural differences here, or barriers rather in some other countries, but that psychosocial support network for oncology patients is massive. And the ability to engage in conversation and dialogue around this and bring in different disciplines and practices is really, I would say, a best practice here for other countries. The challenge I'm going to focus on here, which is really nothing new, is the reimbursement landscape and the access landscape. This is huge. Other countries have public systems or two-tiered systems. It does, of course, come on as a cost on society, but there are so many learnings there that are simple that can be in baby steps translated back to the US here to try and provide patients access. Here, an amazing platform for getting a new drug approved very quickly, but then it's always the question of how can the patient get it, right? We play our role in trying to provide patient support programs in compassionate use context, through the different compliance hurdles that happen on the pharma side. But at some point, even our hands are tied, right? After a drug's been on the market and approved for a while. So accessibility for patients is huge here. Now that I live in the US and as well as I see it live, aside from working in a global role and for Bayer and in oncology, being a patient myself too, it's so challenging. And this is something that really, really, I wish I could change overnight.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I do also have personal stories of doctors prescribed X and I get to the pharmacy and your insurance company is not going to pay for this. So
yeah. Yep, it's a shared responsibility and a lot of accountability for everyone, not just us. I mean, we get thrown under the bus as pharma always because of mistakes the industry has made in the past that we've taken huge steps forward to rectify those and really change in our ways. And we do see that. I can tell you that personally now, not even commenting from a Bayer standpoint, but just looking at the industry and what's out there, and it's how it's helped family members of mine to bring these drugs to market. But it has to be a shared accountability. And right now, everybody's trying to offload this access accountability on someone else from the industry stakeholders.
I definitely see that improving in the future. It has to, because the way it's going right now, it's not working for anyone, really. As you said, even on the pharma side, you're running into difficulties. Providers are running, going back and forth with insurance companies. Who's going to pay? How can we get the patient the best treatment? The insurance company has, or the payer has, a responsibility to all of their patients to make sure that they are able to fund everyone's medication. So hopefully in the future, there'll be a solution, because there has to be a solution.
I hope so. I hope so. I know it's baby steps that everyone's trying to collectively take forward, but it's iterative, right? There's not going to be this just, you overnight everything is going to change, but it is iterative. So as long as everyone does their fair share in trying to make this happen, efforts collectively come together at some point, and we do start to see changes.
So in the last year, telemedicine has really taken off. We have, by necessity, have had to move away from office settings and go more virtual. And I think this technology is at least in part here to stay. So it tells a lot of the patient's experience is dependent upon their rapport with the medical team, and that's hard to do on via Zoom or via Teams meeting. Can you provide some insights on what a best practice that has worked for you as you have transitioned to more of a work from home telemedicine model or teleeducation model, I should say?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of these best practices apply to pretty much anyone in a remote context, but also especially for oncology patients from what we hear. So I can reflect on some best practices that were shared by some of our key opinion leaders or thought leaders in the oncology world, actually here from the US. Definitely, they have set up more regular checkpoints, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, with the patients to make sure that these patients oncology patients don't feel like they're left behind in the wake of the pandemic and that they've taken a back seat, even though unfortunately they have at some point. So more regular touch points with the patients, even quick text messages, right, through personal communication networks that some physicians are comfortable. Of course, this is very much a personal choice. In the appointments that they have through telemedicine that they set up, they usually set them up a little bit longer because they want to take the time to break the ice, right? In the absence of face-to-face, have maybe slightly lengthier discussions with the patient around what's happening in their everyday life via, within a clinical context, focusing on body language too, which is really, really important, I think, for all of us. To really look at the body language and try and understand what is there anything else that they're trying to communicate, because in the absence of face-to-face, it becomes a little bit harder to see, for example, hand movements or nail picking or otherwise on a Zoom call. So trying to navigate through that as well. Overall, I mean, it seems to work well. You, of course, have patients that are, older, significantly older in age, that aren't as comfortable using these technologies. And so that's another barrier as well, is to try and get the patient to embrace the technology and really take full advantage of it. So it's definitely a model that has worked. I think the pandemic has shown that. In what context is the question, but definitely a lot of best practices around that. On the pharma side, when we communicate, it's a little bit different because we're not working with or interacting with the patients directly. But when it comes to our key opinion leaders or any of our allied healthcare professionals, what we try and do is we try and keep any information that we're sharing shorter, bite-sized, very much conversational, light. We've taken a more laid-back approach, which is nice, right? When you think of pharma, you always think of very cookie cutter, very structured, and its ways and interactions are very formal. And what I personally like about what the pandemic has brought is we're all the same. It's more of a biotech approach of how we communicate and interact internally and then also externally with our external stakeholders. So it's more laid back, it's more genuine, I find, and people are much more willing to share what's truly on mind rather than feel like they're in this context where they just have to speak to whatever topic is being discussed in the immediate instance. So definitely a lot of advantages that have come from the telemedicine world. I don't know if it's going to predominantly be the main form. I don't think it will be. Actually, we're seeing trends for otherwise, but we'll see what happens with that.
So it's a new tool. Maybe in the future not the only tool, but something that I can definitely see the application, as I said, was mentioned earlier, for rural patients
For
to
sure.
communicate with specialists that are outside of their area. Maybe they don't have the resources to travel hundreds of miles to see a specialist. This might be a tool to kind of get them additional access.
For sure. I mean, it was coming anyway before. We were already looking at telemedicine and leveraging telemedicine. I think it was just resistance a little bit to change that was accelerated by the pandemic. But you're absolutely right when it comes to rural settings and patients not having to travel long distances or not having a caregiver to help them travel, lower healthcare costs ultimately that telemedicine supports with. The mixed model is probably what's going to emerge, and this is what we're seeing signals for right now. When you get to the bottom of a conversation with a patient or with a physician nowadays, especially in the oncology space, they still say nothing replaces a face-to-face interaction. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
But having a mixed model approach where maybe based on schedule and you start to alternate with telemedicine versus in-person visits, that then makes the most sense. So the acceleration because of the pandemic was imminent, but it is here to stay. I don't think in the context of how it was initially used at the start of the pandemic, just because we had no choice. So definitely more face-to-face, especially, it also helps for not only rural patients, but patients that have to stay at home, right? That cannot be traveling for any reasons or have to be in home because of care or physical, clinical conditions. So we'll definitely start to see an uptick of it across other therapeutic areas as well outside of oncology.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that you mentioned text message between patient and provider as a new form, because this is, again, another like technology was going there. The world was going more towards that kind of communication. And I guess the pandemic has just pushed us over.
Very much so. Yep. Text message, other ways of contacting them, social media, tweeting, Instagram, it's all happening. Of course, there are all these compliance discussions, right? And it's very much personal based on the patient or the healthcare professional as to what degree they want to use it in, because these are primarily for private use. But we've definitely seen an increase in the use of these different platforms. So this is the future. I think we have to navigate through the compliance barriers, but there's a huge opportunity to leverage all of these different platforms, not just telemedicine, to be able to help that communication network that really puts the patient at the center of everything that we're doing.
Absolutely. And there are use cases for text message done in a compliant and effective manner. And I love what you said about patient or provider communications within healthcare in general becoming more laid back, relaxed, and as a result, genuine. And I think that the therapy development process can only improve when we can have real conversations with people in a way that they are comfortable with.
I agree. It's again, the technology is going to help, right? All the disruption that we're seeing because of technology in general across the healthcare industry, but the upside as well come to that is the way we communicate, the choice of words we use, emojis, all of these little things make a huge difference, right? Getting a text message from someone with a smiley face at the end versus the stiff, traditional email that's lengthy and has to be super corporate, etc. Huge difference for sharing truly what's on top of mind for you and the different perspectives that you have.
It's interesting that by putting a computer between ourselves, we become more human.
I know. And even the topic of backgrounds, right? So we've had this discussion so many times internally. Some people choose to hide their background. I'm doing it right now. Some people choose to show their backgrounds intentionally because they want to be able to create that stronger bond between whoever they're speaking to on the other end of the line to say, hey, this is how I live. This is how I am. Here are my kids running across, half dressed. Here's what's happening with my spouse. Yeah. So it makes a difference, right? It does make it more personable. And then of course there are privacy issues where certain people just would rather not have the insides of their homes showing. It's very much a personal choice, but these are all real considerations that weren't really tangible before that have had to become tangible now because of the way we communicate.
Absolutely. And speaking of communication, there often is a caretaker involved. So it's not just one person, it's usually several people. And I just wanted to ask you a bit about that communication. So how do we incorporate or what do you see how a best practice of incorporating kind of caretakers in this
Mhm,
process?
mhm.
Um,
So
'Cause I
we,
know sometimes, my husband will notice something that I don't notice,
yeah.
or vice versa. I'll go to his doctor's office and I'll say, um, actually, he did want to ask you
Mm.
about.
Yeah, I mean, we see this a lot, right? I've been in clinic preceptorships or other contexts where the patient won't voice what's actually happening, and the caretaker will pop up and say, actually, no, this person did this and that, and this is what I saw. And then it really opens the eyes of the oncologist to say, okay, well, there is something else that's happening here. Is this clinical progression that we're considering or otherwise? So the caregivers play a huge, huge role. On the pharma side, we recognize this. And so one thing that we've done differently than the past is we've now started to create content, medical education material, specifically directed not only towards patients, but patients and caregivers as well. So it could
Okay.
be as simple as taking one of our key publications that are usually a mess of scientific jargon that anyone starts to read the abstract and they want to, if they're not in the field, just
Eyes
switch
will
to another
cross.
page. Yeah, absolutely. And we recognize that. So we've now started to publish lay versions of these publications or abstracts so that the most important person, which is the patient, reads it and understands what this is about, and or the caregiver as well. We've also started to have shared conversations with caregivers, also in the context of focus groups, presentations where they come in and help educate us on what is it that they're looking for that's less on the scientific side, but more around that quality of life element and how the conversations happen in clinic between the patient, the caregiver, and the physician to identify these goals, treatment goals that end up being shared with the physician and caregiver. So the caregiver piece is huge. The caregiver provides so much mental support and ease for patients as well, right? Knowing that there's somebody else there looking at them as they go through the unimaginable stress of navigating through the disease and just accepting what they're going through and pooling all of their efforts to be able to fight it, all their positivity, all their internal strength, their mental and physical strength to fight it. The caregiver then is able to support with all of the different elements, right? And it's usually rarely one caregiver. It ends up being a bunch of different caregivers that play their own role. And so when it comes to fighting cancer, and we have so many stories of survivors and people that are currently fighting it right now, and you look around that network, and it really is truly a shared effort. Mainly coming from the patient, but that shared effort that the caregivers bring. And it's very inspirational. I'm getting goosebumps now just thinking about it.
It's so exciting that they are now becoming more and more a part of the therapy development process.
Very much
So
so, very much so. And like a personal story from my end, I've been in the space for over 7 years in oncology and working in it and living it and breathing it. And my graduate schooling was in it. And then unfortunately, my mom was diagnosed last year, the week before lockdown with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer. And so she's fighting it. But now I was thrown out of the professional world into the personal world of oncology and having to live through it with my mom and support her and whatnot. So, a lot of these lessons that I'm now learning on the personal side, I'm trying to pull back into a professional context to say, this is truly what we see on the personal side, but also what lessons I'm learning that, we can bring back to help the way we do things in the pharma industry. So.
absolutely. And I'm excited for how we're going to progress and how we're going to incorporate more and more. So started off, I'm sure, very closed loop. And as it expands, and as I said, we're going to do this co-creation with the patients and with the network of allied health professionals, and now incorporating the caregivers as well. I can only see positive things for the future of patient care. I love to end my conversations on kind of something hopeful and positive note. So if you could wave your magic wand, and I know not possible in real life, and change anything in oncology care today, what would it be? I know it's in the
Only
past.
one once. Only one. Okay, so if it was only
Or
one,
maybe if you have more than one, that's okay too.
So one I would say the patient voice, empowering the patient more than what we've already done. We've taken big steps forward, but again, when you look at, for example, breast cancer patients versus maybe prostate cancer patients, where men traditionally don't speak up as much as women do, that voice, that patient voice, if I could wave the wand, I would empower every single oncology patient in whatever type of cancer they have to be equally empowered from a medical education perspective, but also from an ability to speak up about their cancer. Not only motivating other patients and having this domino effect where now other patients are empowered to talk, but really around creating that awareness and advocacy at the same level for whatever type of cancer it is. So that I think my first one would be for that.
So encouraging patient self-advocacy.
Encouraging patient self-advocacy and really empowering the patient from our end to be able to get to that step.
Absolutely. And I know that you provide some resources. You have resources available. What I'd like to do is kind of share that in the show notes.
Sure.
So maybe we'll include some links where people can educate themselves and share that with their patients.
Sure, absolutely. Whatever we can do to help that patient education material get out there and really across the globe in terms of supporting patients for what to look for and what they need and empowering them to meet their goals, their treatment goals as well.
Absolutely. If any of our listeners want to continue the conversation, reach out with any follow-up questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can reach out to me via LinkedIn. I can also give you my email address, which actually you already have, so they can feel free to email me. Anything I can do to support and for the listeners out there, if they have any questions or even if I can't answer them, at least redirect them in the right way. We do have a good network, not just within pharma, but with all of these different stakeholders involved. So if there's anything we can do to create that link and liaise our listeners or anyone else with out there, it would be a real pleasure. So feel free to reach out anytime for anything.
Wonderful. And I will add those links as well to the show notes. This has been a great conversation, Sherin. I want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for also playing your role in getting a lot of these important messages out there for everyone. You're doing amazing work and keep it up. I'm going to say bye temporarily, but I'm sure we're going to cross paths again.
Absolutely.
You've been listening to Working in Oncology. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.